Hi, greetings everyone. My name is Sarah Barnes, and on behalf of Campbell & Company, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Performance Metrics, how to use performance metrics to manage up, down, and out, the fourth of our 2011-2012 Campbell & Company webinar series. Before we begin today's interesting presentation and discussion, I'd like to quickly review some logistics for those of you who may be new to Campbell & Company webinars. To ensure you have the best webinar experience possible, please follow these tips. Number one, close any programs other than GoToTraining that are running on your computer. Call in using a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. Move away your cell phone away from your computer because that can cause interference. And then finally, if you experience visual issues, send a chat to Campbell & Company, or you can contact GoTo at 1-800-263-6317. And also, we want to make this as interactive as possible. And during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question or comment, and then we'll relay them to Carrie as we go throughout the presentation, and I will be moderating that as well. So, and also today's webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, maybe a little bit more, and you'll earn 1 continuing education credit for your participation. That's good for certification with CFRE International. And about an hour after the webinar, you will receive an email from GoToWebinars that includes a web address to download your certificate, the PDF of the presentation, as well as a code to receive a complimentary registration for our next webinar. And so now I would like to turn it over to Carrie Douglas. Carrie?
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Carrie Dahlquist, and I am the Director of Strategic Information Services at Campbell & Company. I came to Campbell & Company last April, and since that time, I've had the opportunity to work with a wide range of organizations representing all sectors and sizes. So I'm thrilled to be here today talking with you about performance metrics. Just wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself. Prior to joining Campbell & Company, I was the in-house fundraising counsel at the University of Chicago, focused on strategic planning and campaign management. In that role, I spent a lot of my time developing and using metrics to inform goal setting, decision-making, and communication across a large, complex institution. And I've also been a major gift officer, a leadership annual giving officer, and an annual fund manager. And in those roles as well, I've used metrics to track my own work, to manage others, and to report up and out. So that's me. I also just wanted to share a little bit for those with us about what we know about you, the audience. Sarah was kind enough to send out a survey last week, and many of you responded, which is great. This is what we know about you. First of all, we're fortunate to have a great group of professionals on the line with us today. You come from a wide variety of organizations, and there are many sectors being represented here today, both small and large shops, and from a variety of different industries. So I think that we're going to have a great perspective is represented on the phone, and I'm hopeful that metrics will be useful for all of you. Some of you have already experimented with metrics before, and some of you may already even have a system in place. It seems, though, that of that group, many of you are unsure that you're tracking the right information, and most of you are unsure of what to do with it now that you have the information being tracked. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to focus on that a bit today as well. We're going to quickly review the agenda for our discussion today. First of all, we want to focus on a discrete set of goals, and I want to have a very, very quick discussion about what performance metrics are, at least from my perspective, both the benefits and the challenges of setting up metrics. And then we want to quickly dive directly into selecting metrics, managing by them, and evaluating them. And as Sarah said, we'll be taking questions throughout the webinar, but we'll definitely leave some time at the end for question and answer as well. Great. So we're going to focus just for a moment on a set of goals for today. My goals is to have a discussion that will give you the knowledge to immediately begin planning for performance metrics, to give you the tools to implement them when ready. And I want to take just a moment to say that while we are not going to get into a specific discussions about metrics by function, because today we really, really want to focus on the process for successful implementation, but I will make a sample list of specific metrics by function available on our website for you to download after this presentation. And if anybody has questions about that, the third goal for our discussion today is to give you the support that you need if you have questions. So I just want to reiterate that I'm available today on the phone, but I'm also available after our discussion today if you have questions about any of the materials that we review or any of the materials that you review later after downloading this from the website. Okay. Great. Just quickly want to, and I'm sure that most everybody on the line with us already has some sense of what performance metrics are, but just to be specific, I want to take a moment to define what it is we're trying to accomplish here. I think one of the most useful definitions for performance metrics that I've seen is that they are quantitative indicators used to measure, stimulate, and report on individual and institutional performance. And specifically, we want to acknowledge that that is typically being used towards specified goals. And in fact, that will be the objective of our discussion today. Great. Let's quickly review some benefits of metrics. And I'm sure many of you have experienced these to the extent that you've already been thinking about or implementing your own series of metrics. I think in my experience, there really are three categories of benefits around planning, management, and communication. The benefits around planning is that this really gives you the opportunity to think clearly about setting goals and being clear about the priorities of the organization or the institution, and also the priorities of your program. And then it reinforces a planning process, which I think sometimes people take for granted. By having an annual, for example, an annual process of evaluating your goals and thinking about the next year, it actually forces you to have an annual planning process for each year. Which sounds redundant, but I think actually gets really overlooked in many organizations. I then want to focus on management and the benefits of metrics around really helping manage your organization. I think first of all, by monitoring the progress that you see on a, whether it's monthly or annual, quarterly basis, and really with a focus on increasing your productivity, whether that's efficiency, effectiveness, being aware of your ROI, and I think being able to justify requests for investments or reallocation of resources as you think about managing your programs, and metrics will be able to help you do all of those. And then broadly speaking, communicating both to internal and external audience, frankly, about the planning and the management pieces that we've already discussed, but being able to share those broadly with people on your staff, people in your leadership, and then your donors and funders as well.
We did, Carrie, we did have a question from the field that said if you could repeat the definition of performance metrics.
I can try. Yeah, I think what I said is that from my perspective, that we're really focused on quantitative indicators used to measure, stimulate, and report on individual and institutional performance. And then I believe I stressed the point that that's really going to be with a focus on establishing goals.
Great, thanks, Karen.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to challenges, because I feel like this slide, while it's only one slide in while it's only one slide in my entire presentation, I think that this is such a critical piece where people get tripped up, and I've experienced many of these challenges along the way, and have had to really work hard to overcome them. And so I would imagine there are people on the line right now. They'll be nodding in agreement as we go through these. So I want to acknowledge them quickly, but I also want to stress that as you work through the process of setting up metrics, if you're having problems, I would suggest that you come back to this slide and look at where on the table here do you see yourself getting tripped up, and what can you do specifically to try to manage that? I think first and foremost, getting buy-in, and that's from both your leadership and your staff. You certainly don't want to invest a lot of resources into establishing these metrics if it turns out that your leadership isn't going to take them seriously, or they're not going to acknowledge these as viable inputs when it comes to you requesting additional resources or reallocation of resources. To the same extent, you really want to get your staff to buy in so that they are on board from the beginning and are excited about the opportunity to be able to have consistency of message around what it is they're going to be focused on for the year. I think selecting the right metrics is a real challenge, and I think that we want to make sure that when we're thinking about metrics, we really want balanced metrics, and we're going to get into that more later. But inputs versus outputs, your leading indicators versus your lagging indicators, and really being thoughtful about what incentives we're driving in each metric that we're tracking, and then being consistent. And I think consistent can mean many different things within the organization, but I think first and foremost, once you get to metrics, you want to be sure that everybody is using the same terminology to describe the same set of metrics. So I think really defining terms in this bullet is important. On the bottom half of the screen, we're talking about just making sure that metrics are trackable, and that sounds really easy, but it's not. Making sure that you can get information both in and out of your system, or what other systems you're going to need in order to support this effort is really important. And then finally, are they manageable? How much time does it take to manage them? Who's going to have ownership over these, and how will they be expected to utilize them throughout the course of your fiscal year? Move on. And then finally, before we jump right into the process, I just want to leave you with some initial thoughts. And I think first and foremost, especially when you're starting out, you really want to keep this simple. 3 to 5 metrics is a good place to start. You can always add more, and we're going to suggest that you be evaluating throughout the process. So if it seems that something isn't working for you, you can always go back and change it. But in particular, when you're just working in implementation, you don't want to overwhelm either your staff or your leadership with too much information. I think being consistent as much as possible once you get out of your sort of beta test environment is really important. It promotes clarity for your staff. And I also want to, while we're talking about clarity for staff, I think it's important to recognize that one of the ways that these help in terms of consistency and clarity for staff is, even if there's turnover, and I know that many of our organizations do experience turnover, if there are a consistent set of metrics in place, I think that that's a really great grounding point for us to remind ourselves and our new staff about what we're tracking, why we're tracking it, how does it align with our strategic values and the mission of our organization. Also, just beta testing. Keep it simple, be consistent, and beta test. Do not, for the benefit of your leadership and your staff, do not set up metrics and then tomorrow start telling people that they will be evaluated. I think it will really scare people off, and it will overwhelm both your staff and your leadership. So start this process at some point, in the fiscal year with a goal of having a refined and confirmed metric system in place for the beginning of your next fiscal year. Or if you're at the beginning of your fiscal year, have the goal of, the second half of your fiscal year, really having this driving evaluations. And then finally, just get started. I think it can be a little paralyzing when you're thinking about ways to track an entire program, and you don't want to get yourself in a loop where you think too much about it. Again, if it's simple, if it's consistent, and if you've tested it, there's no reason to not just dive right in and get responses from the people along the way that are utilizing this. Okay. Now we're going to dive right into my steps, and they may be different in each institution, but I think that the process for developing a legitimate set of performance metrics is going to be similar, wherever you are. And I think this first step, which we're calling upfront work, is really, really critical, and frankly is one that gets overlooked a lot. And I think if people dive directly into, oh, I know what industry standards are, or I know what most people are doing, or I think I already know what I want to track, so I'm just going to implement something. I think if you go directly to that step without really thinking about the upfront work that's necessary, you will likely have to put a lot of time and effort in on the back end to sort of shore up this step number one. And we'll go through it quickly because I think it's pretty, and it's basically common sense here, but we really do want you to get institutional buy-in. We mentioned it before, but both from your leadership and from your staff. If your leadership doesn't buy into this, as we said, then when you want to use your metrics to inform decision-making or request for increased resources or discussions about annual projections, if you have a budget office, and I hear this a lot, if you have a budget office that tends to add 3% or 5% onto last year's goals as a mark for this year, and you want to really shift their thinking to having annual planning focused on the potential in the pipeline, then you really need to go to them in the beginning of this process and make sure that they will take it seriously when you come to them with metrics on the health and potential in the pipeline. You don't want to do a lot of work up front and then have that not recognized in the back. And then we've already talked about the importance of staff as well. I think that recruiting a team, I call it a team, a task force, or a group here, is really critical as well. You don't want to necessarily have to do this as an island. I think it helps to gain buy-in, and it ensures that you haven't missed anything, which is important. And then finally, reviewing the goals for your organization and your team or department is really, really critical. I think it's really easy to assume, that we know what we need to track. But if you make those assumptions without, looking at whatever goals you have, for example, your strategic plan, if you've got a goal to grow your program or to grow participation or to grow engagement or, whatever the priorities that have been articulated is in your strategic planning process, you really want to make sure that you're able to reflect them in your annual planning process and your metrics in particular.
We do have a question that said that there is a big challenge in terms of getting institutional buy-in. It seems that getting institutional buy-in is complicated. The finance area and the CEO have their own thoughts. How do you work around that?
I think, and I think that's a critical, I'm so glad somebody brought it up. I think it's a really critical question, and it's probably, as I said, if you don't experience it right away, you will likely experience it at some point, and therefore it's much better to get a sense up front about whether or not this will be taken seriously at the institutional leadership level. My suggestion is, if you've got a president, a CEO, a VP, I don't know what level that person is talking about, but if you've got leadership that is not on board with this, then you may need to take a step back and really start the educational process. I think if that doesn't work, then you can go ahead and start to track information that you think is useful and that you think may ultimately inform conversations with them, and you may have to sort of prove to them as you go that this is helpful, that it's informative, and at least for maybe it takes one fiscal year of showing sort of side-by-side projections. Here's what happened when the budgeted office projected 3% over last year's fundraising goal, and here's what what does that look like? Here's what it looks like if we project based on the health and potential in our prospect pool. And what does that mean then for the long-term health of the organization? Can you show, as you develop a pipeline and you start to develop a plan, if you can show that it's a more thoughtful process? I think that my experience has been it's difficult at first. You may have to sort of have those two in tandem and be able to, at the end of the fiscal year, prove to leadership that there was real value in approaching this in a more rigorous way and tracking throughout the year. And I would also say that as you develop metrics, and we're going to talk about the importance of being able to report on them, as you track metrics and you are able to share them with your leadership, I think that's another opportunity to just sort of train them to look for certain variables, and then to be able to drive conversations about planning around them.
Great.
Okay, great. Let's move ahead then. So I think we've covered the upfront work. I just want to remind everybody that the last thing we talked about a moment ago was really evaluating your strategic plan and thinking about what that means in terms of performance metrics. And I think that gets us to alignment, which is at the top of our screen for selecting metrics. And it's critical to be able to take those organizational goals and think about how do you translate them to team and individual goals to ensure that you are aligned with the focus of the organization or the institution, because that, to the earlier commenter's question, if you're not in alignment, that will absolutely derail this process. I mentioned this earlier, but making sure that the metrics are balanced, really being thoughtful about what it is you ultimately want to track, which are those lagging indicators, but also being thoughtful of those inputs that are going to go, that are going to be leading indicators throughout the year to make sure that you're on track for your final goals. We don't want to focus solely on dollars raised. We want to focus on, how many solicitations are being planned and asked and booked that will ultimately lead to those dollars being raised. And then minimizing trade-offs. This is something that I think that we really, really need to be cognizant about as leaders as we start to develop performance metrics. And what I'm talking about when I say minimize trade-offs is think about the incentives, the behaviors that you're going to be incentivizing by each of the performance metrics plans that you develop. So, for example, if you're focused on gift processing and you really want to increase productivity and you want to, get more transactions processed per officer, that's great, and that's a valiant and valuable goal. But you probably, as you really focus on speed, accuracy may be in jeopardy as well. So you probably also want to be tracking metrics that focus on, how many corrections are being made. So absolutely, what's the volume of transactions, but at the same time, what was the accuracy of those transactions as well. And then finally, just keep it clear and simple. And again, we're going to come back to this idea throughout the presentation, but for both leadership and staff, articulate it as clearly and simply as possible. Again, just a few metrics to start out with will help this. Making sure that it's in alignment with the goals of the institution will help as well. Okay. Great. Okay. I have a step 2.5 here before we move on to reporting, which is, just a simple gut check. And I really want you to focus on, after you've been thoughtful with your group about what the goals of the organization are and what metrics can you put in place that are in alignment with those? What is it that you want to be driving with your own particular program? Are these draft metrics trackable? Can you get them in the system? If yes, that's great. Move on to step 3. If no, then I would challenge you to think about, are there other similar related metrics that are trackable? Is there another way that you can get to the information that's already in the system? If you think about it a slightly different way, or if you think about a slightly different input or output or a leading or a lagging indicator. If no, and if there's something that's really, really critical to you and it's not, it's not able to be tracked in the system, then you need to think about what kind of additional resources are going to be needed. And I've done this before. I've had to set up systems outside of my database of record because of specific metrics that we wanted to track. And I think, any consultant at Campbell & Company would tell you to beware of shadow databases. So as I say, that there may be information you track outside of your database, I just want to caution, again, that you should be trying to track it in your database. And if the information is simply not trackable in the database, then you're going to need to think about, how are you tracking it outside of the database, and what additional resources are needed, and are they reasonable given what you're trying to accomplish with your program? How much time will it take to build them, and what will, is it worth the eventual output? Okay. So let's assume at this point that you have established that metrics are either trackable in your system, or you've gone through the exercise of figuring out, how you'll track them outside of the system, we are going to focus on reporting, which I think is pretty straightforward, but I just wanted to acknowledge that there are a lot of different layers of reporting, of both external and internal audiences. And, for some of the smaller organizations, you may not need all of these levels. And for some of the larger organizations, there might be more levels as you think about, different schools or departments or, staff outside of your own. But this sort of gives you a general idea of how you're going to have to report and how the numbers are going to have to roll up, again, to drive conversations with leadership and focus on evaluation and planning. So let's move forward. Great. All right, we're going to dive into these very, very quickly. And all I'm trying to communicate here is that, reporting is important. It's important at each level. And we've made some suggestions about how you might want to think about tracking. I think, in particular for individual staff, so if whether I'm a major gift officer or a gift processing officer, I need to have available to me in some way, shape, or form my individual progress throughout the year. And ideally, that's going to be some kind of dashboard so that I don't need to go into the system and bother anybody else to get me a report. It's great to be able to open our systems and sort of see at a glance where we are, in particular against our progress to goals. And then, depending on the function that we're talking about, we want to talk about both the individual performance, team and program progress goals, but also, if there are planned activities if possible, we really want to be able to focus on those as well. So again, if I'm a major gift officer and I have plan solicitations coming up, I want to be able to see those on my dashboard as well. For supervisors, I suggest you may want to be able to have that dashboard available for supervisors as well, simply because as we know, leadership wants what they want when they want it sometimes, and rather than having to produce an ad hoc report every time somebody wants to check the numbers, it's great if they can have a dashboard built in. But also there will have to be most likely some kind of standard report. And I think these timeframes are going to vary from organization to organization. I've made some suggestions here, but so for supervisors, whether that's your program manager, your DOD, your VP, to give them a dashboard that talks about perhaps individuals, depending on how large the teams are, but certainly teams and program progress to goals, but then have them have access to that regular standard report is really, really critical. Again, if possible, we really want to focus too on laying out the planned activities as they're coming down the pike. And then program leadership, here's where we make a transition to. We're probably not focused on the individual anymore, but the team's progress and the program progress. And here's also, I think, where we make a transition from describing planned activities, perhaps in the way that they queue up in the database, and really converting those to have a discussion about projections about future activities.
Carrie, we did have a question regarding volunteers and metrics. And the question was if you'll be discussing working with volunteers and those metrics, particularly volunteers who may not be familiar with this process.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly can. I think at the beginning I talked about the worksheet that would be available on our website by function, and there's absolutely discussion about volunteers in that, but we can take a quick moment and talk about the way that you, is the caller talking about using volunteers or communicating metrics to volunteers?
I believe communicating metrics to volunteers, especially those who may not be familiar with development, or believe that dollar goals are the primary indicators to track.
Okay. Yeah, and I want to stress too that I didn't focus particularly on fundraising, because obviously we've got a range of functions on the call today, and while major gift fundraising activity is important, so is stewardship activity, and so is gift processing, and so is the annual funds calling program. And so we're not going to dive into too many specifics, but I think generally, I think that when you're talking about volunteers, and we're going to talk about board and institutional leadership, so I put volunteers in that category as well. Again, it may just be an educational process. I think many of these people who are so close to our organization and so critical to our efforts come in with their own take on the world, and it may take a bit of time, like so many of the activities that we have to train our volunteers on. It may take some time to convince them that that this effort is valuable and that we're tracking the right information. But I think the good news is, for those who come from a more corporate background in particular, the idea of metrics has been around for a very, very long time. So you may have some volunteers that you just have to convince that you're tracking the right information, but I think generally the idea of tracking and monitoring and using these types of metrics to evaluate process and progress and plan for the future is something that is that most volunteers are pretty comfortable with.
Great, thanks, Karen.
Mm-hmm. And I think as we move forward to talk about program leadership, you can think about using these types of dashboards and standard reports to inform your volunteers as well. Again, when you get to program leadership, and here I'm talking about your top program leadership, whether it's your president or your CEO or whoever's at the head of your organization, what's the level of information that they need from your team, and from so again, if we are talking about rolling up from the individual to the team level now to the more sort of global macro level. They may, depending on the focus and the propensity of your leadership for these types of metrics, and I've seen some who want everything because they are very analytical people, and some who are really, they just want the bottom line and they want to make sure that somebody's tracking it and that we're on track. So you're going to have to, I think, at every step of the way, but in particular as you get into conversations about leadership, you're going to have to evaluate, what they need and how often they get it. And here I've said, for your program leadership, is it a bi-monthly report? Is it a monthly report? You're going to know better than us. But having a regular report, I think that informs them. If nothing else, I think reinforces the fact that you're using these metrics, that you're managing by them, and that they're important to the health and vitality of the program. And then I just wanted to give a couple quick samples. Again, we're not going to get into too many functional area specific examples, but I think this is something that most of the people on the call are probably going to be fairly comfortable with in terms of tracking metrics for a major gift officer, or I would say, frankly, any frontline officer, whether this was corporate and foundation or plan giving or leadership annual giving. The idea of having a plan for how many proposals you will ask and how many you will book, or how many proposals you will submit, solicitations asked, and the idea of how many of those you'll book, and then tracking visits as well is certainly one that I think most of the industry is fairly comfortable with. So that's why I used it here. And then on the bottom of the screen, I'm just showing a couple of simple dashboards that you could have up on your screen as you logged into your own individual system. On the next screen, we're going to see another view. Again, these are just samples. But as you think about, if I'm a major gift officer and I've got, let's say, 100 prospects in my portfolio, really, while the previous slide showed perhaps the information that I've agreed with my supervisor we're going to track and manage and use to really build out projections for the program, that doesn't necessarily mean that as an individual officer there aren't other pieces of information that may be valuable and that may be useful to have up on my own personal dashboard. And I know, for me, when I did major gift work, really trying to keep my head around, getting in touch with as many of the people throughout the course of the year that I could was important. So the idea of tracking, unique prospects may also be valuable for your organization. And again, this is gonna vary by institution. Here's another sample. Here we're just tracking, this is a month-to-month basis and a year-to-date total of your actions by type, giving you a sense of, as a major gift officer, how am I, we've already agreed that we're tracking visits in that first screen as sort of a vital way of tracking my performance metrics as a major gift officer, but this just gives me some sense of, all of my other activities over the course of the month and the year. And finally, who in my portfolio am I getting in touch with over the course of the year? Do I have a balanced portfolio, and am I accessing all of them? Again, it's not in that sort of most critical band of metrics that I've agreed with my supervisor will really drive planning, but it doesn't mean that it's not important for me to know as an individual officer. Here's a couple of reports, and I'm sure that most people on the phone have, many people on the phone have some versions of these, and I try to keep them very simple because they're going to be different in every system. But some way to track the detail, and in this case we're talking about major gift officers, so I have an action detail by the month and a solicitation detail for the year to date to really kind of keep me on track. And both of these really sort of do drive back to that first chart that kept us in focus for our annual planning or strategic planning for the year. This is an example of, as we move forward, a team report. And the idea here is simply to acknowledge that the metrics that you set for the individual officers can roll up and be informative at the team level. And this is, another way to look at it, summarized for the team, and again with the same type of visual graphics that you can share with your leadership. As we move on to sort of the perhaps more external audiences, and thinking about what kind of information you need to communicate with your executive or administrative leadership. Perhaps maybe this is, for those of you with more layers, this is actually that CEO or top administrator or executor. Again, it's going to vary from institution to institution, but the idea is that now you need, even less information and perhaps more focus on how that information is informing future activity. And again, with board leadership, I think this gets back to our earlier comment about volunteers. This may be the type of report that you can use to share with your volunteers. Or in the next bullet, we talk about donors and funders and some kind of regular report that tracks progress to goals and articulates, and I think this is really, really critical when you move into that more external audience, articulates both the micro and the macro impact of these indicators.
We do have another question that's along this line. Do you have any experience attempting to extend metrics to non-fundraising executive partners? And this is more in the higher education category, thinking of deans, program side, unit chiefs, provosts, and presidents, moving beyond those executive program side partners, simply counting the dollars raised for their programs, et cetera.
So establishing metrics for programs outside of sort of the central development office. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think so. I think that's what the person is getting at, is the experience attempting to extend metrics to non-fundraising executive partners.
Yes, I do. And I did a lot of that at the University of Chicago. And I don't want to take too much time, so I'm happy to have a follow-up conversation with whoever that is offline where I can go into more detail. But I think that you absolutely can do that. It was definitely a process to gain that institutional buy-in in the beginning. My experience was once we educated people, and we had to have a series of conversations with them about what they thought was important to their program and what they thought needed to be tracked. And in some cases, we had to incorporate that in some way to our metrics, which was fine. But at the end of the day, we were able to get really tremendous buy-in, and it really helped improve communication, frankly, across the institution. And I would say that, I experienced that with both, deans and directors of schools, units, and divisions. I also experienced that similarly, excuse me, when you look at functions that people don't necessarily think about tracking as much. So, I had success thinking about ways to track special events and metrics for special events and communications. And I think that idea of having a broad-based approach where, you feel confident that you're tracking something that is relevant to the program and you can communicate it broadly, is really a great way to engender support for the program. But again, I'm happy to continue that conversation offline and give that person some specifics around my experiences, because I have a lot of them around that specific topic. All right, so now we've talked about, you've gained buy-in, you've set up metrics, you've gotten them into your system, you're able to report on them. I think that, this step 4 of managing by metrics is one of the most critical areas that we may sort of fall short in our efforts. And it's unfortunate because at this point you put an incredible amount of resources into developing these metrics. And, my experience is that it takes a lot of effort to train yourself in the beginning to move from simply looking at metrics, once a year in that evaluate, or twice a year, let's say, at calendar year end and fiscal year end, to make sure that you're on track, and really, really incorporating them into those regular meetings that we talked about a moment ago with reporting, and I've acknowledged them here as well. That you really want conversations about metrics. They are not the only thing that is important. But they are critically important to informing conversations with your supervisors, with your staff, with your leadership. And we've got some suggestions here for how you might want to really incorporate them into the regular one-on-one meetings, regular team meetings, the evaluation process, and I think in particular the strategic planning process for the following year. And that's at every level, from individuals up through your administrative and board leadership as well, and with a focus on evaluation and informed strategic planning.
I do have a question in terms of the overall. How often do you look at the metrics? You put in there bi-weekly or weekly. And what is your overall recommendation?
I think that I've made some suggestions. Here about how I've used them in the past. I don't want to be too prescriptive because everybody has clearly their own mechanism in place for managing, and some people may have weekly team meetings, some people may have bi-weekly team meetings. Typically, my experience is sort of weekly or bi-weekly meetings, but really having a sense of where those metrics are, and then whether you have monthly meetings one-on-one with your staff or your supervisor. Some people have bi-weekly. I've seen that as well. I think my experience has more been a monthly one-on-one with my staff or my supervisor. But having those metrics in place so that you can talk about, what trends are we seeing, what's happening, where is our performance heading? Does it look like we're on track for calendar year end or for fiscal year end? And if not, is there a reason? Is there something that we need to communicate more broadly? Is there anything that we need to be doing to sort of managing up? Is there good news? Is there bad news? But how is that, monthly or that biweekly review of those metrics informing conversations that we're having with both our staff and our supervisors?
Great, thank you.
And I think we already talked. I think donors and funders, let me just take a quick final moment. And again, I think this is volunteers as well. Again, now we're talking about managing by metrics. So we've got our reports. We've got a bunch of numbers in front of us and them, and we're really, I think when it comes to our donors, our funders, and our volunteers, we're really using that information to be transparent about the progress of the program and our goals for the future. And sometimes that will be in written communication, sometimes that will be at a board meeting, sometimes that will be in a stewardship report. But the idea that you have that information in-house, you are tracking it consistently, and you can communicate about it with those that are closest to the organization is really, really important. Okay. And then finally, step 5. I just want to acknowledge that now you've got information in the system. You can report on it. You are hopefully managing by it, and you should be in your beta test in the beginning. Use a couple months, make sure that this is working for you, it's working for your leadership, it's working for your staff, and evaluate, what you're doing after those few months. Are your metrics still in alignment with the program goals that you articulated early on? save that, save the information that you created at your very first working group meeting where you talked about, the goals of these performance metrics, what you're hoping to accomplish, how you hope they will further the agenda of the organization, and come back a few months later and check to see if, in fact, once things are up and running, does it appear that, the metrics are still in alignment with those program goals that you articulated early on? Are they incentivizing the right behavior? As we talked about earlier for that example of the gift processor, where you've got the trade-off of accuracy and speed. Now that you've had a couple months under your belt looking at those metrics, does it appear that they are in balance? And are you getting the desired behavior? And probably most important, are they manageable for staff and leadership? Once you are able to get the information in and out of the system, and you are hopefully beginning to manage by them, is it manageable? Is it overwhelming? Is there something you need to tweak? Hopefully not, but if it is, this is your opportunity before you sort of go into your full-on performance metrics-based, fiscal year or half of the calendar year, half of the fiscal year. This is your final opportunity to just say, that people are feeling pretty comfortable with what you've established and how you'll be using it going forward.
There's a question that says, looks like a lot of data to manage. What recommendations would you make in order to make this process more efficient?
I think that it is a lot of data to manage. But again, I think when we go back to the samples that I showed earlier with the individual major gift officer, we're getting there. 1 second. One more. Here we go. So in this example, this is all that we're talking about in terms of the metrics. Again, the metrics that we would be reporting sort of up and out, and it's 5 metrics. It's the solicitations being booked and asked, both dollars and numbers, and the number of visits. So I think the subsequent, maybe what the person was asking, the subsequent slides show information that may just be really, really useful to the individual officer to get a sense of the health of their portfolio and their activity throughout the year. But again, being really, really clear that that smaller set of that 3 to 5, and you know what, this may be something that isn't manageable for somebody at the onset of their process. These sort of additional sets, this additional set of information that an individual may want to track on their own portfolio or performance. So I think really, focusing on those 3 to 5 that are critical, that can be rolled up across a team, a department, and an organization, that will really help fuel conversations about resource allocation, planning, budgeting. I think that that's the right place to start. And as you master those and you can think about other information that's going to be useful on an individual basis, you can expand. But starting here and staying focused in the beginning is the easiest way to do it.
Okay. For all of you on the phone or listening in, make sure to type in your questions to Campbell & Company. We'll get those answered. There was another question in terms of what would be some recommendations that you make to smaller shops or with a limited staff size? Where can they start?
I think that, what I just mentioned a moment ago, starting small. I think that, where that might be particularly relevant is in shops where you have one person performing multiple functions. Mm-hmm. So if it's easy for me to say, start with 3 to 5 metrics per function, but if you've got somebody that's wearing 3 hats, how do you quantify the work that they're doing without burdening them too much? And so maybe for them, I wouldn't say don't do it, because if you have somebody wearing 3 hats, chances are that person's probably overwhelmed, and at some point you might want to be having a conversation with leadership about resource allocation or getting additional steps to help support that person. So I think, it's a bit of an unfortunate scenario, because that it might be really overwhelming for that person to be able to create and focus on metrics, but it's probably all the more critical for them to do that. So whether it's maybe in that case, maybe it's 1 or 2 metrics per function area that you're supporting, but getting your, starting somewhere, getting your arms around something that is representative of the work that you're doing to be able to inform conversations in the decision-making process, especially when it comes to resources, is really important.
Great. I think this is along the same line, but going into more specific, what types of metrics would be recommended for an organization that has never measured the fundraising program in any way, other than year-end total? So specific metrics.
Well, I think that for the program, I mean, I think this is
for an organization, fundraising program.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to start. Again, I'll have an example of metrics by function available on our website, and so you may want to be able to draw from that if you are just starting out with these. So I think that tracking at the organizational level, tracking where the dollars are coming in from each one of your programs is really important, and probably most people are doing already. But if you're just starting out, that's important. So if you've only tracked fundraising totals up to this point, let's think about which of those dollars are coming in from your membership program, your annual giving program, your major gift program, your planned giving program, your corporate and foundation program. If you're already doing that, great. Let's break it down, one level further. If it's major, if you now know how many dollars are coming in from your major gift program, are you tracking it by officer? If you aren't, then this slide is probably a good place to start. For your annual giving program, what's your percent participation? What are the dollars raised? What's your percent renewal, reactivation, and acquisition rates? And so I think there are going to be specific metrics per program that you can dive into once you're tracking at the programmatic level.
Great. Another person says, I really like the thought around educating leadership, the CEO and the CFO. Are there, in your mind, a few key things to focus on as to not do too much early on?
Yes. I think that you need to appeal to their, in particular, I found with the CFO types, where in my experience a lot of the budgets are being driven. I mean, those are clearly analytical people. And so I think appealing to their analytic nature to let them know that you want to be helpful in the process, which I think that we've all sort of been, I don't want to say the victims because that's probably too strong a word, but I'm sure there are people on the phone nodding. We've all experienced that case where, your CFO or your budget office suggests, perhaps as a program manager, you submit your plan for the next year and it calls for an increase of X, whether that's dollars or solicitations processed or, gift processing, and somebody higher up comes back to you and says, well, that was a great first step, but really we need an additional $300,000 from you, or 200 or 25 or 3 million, whatever the size of your program, and you don't necessarily have the opportunity, I think, at that point to be able to further inform that process. But I think, once you're tracking information and you can show a pipeline in particular, with I think often this is most relevant when it comes to the fundraising programs, you can start to show a pipeline of your major gift activity. You can start to show trends in your annual fund. I think that my experience is that, again, it may take one round for leadership to value the information that you brought to the table early on and to fully understand how it can inform the decision-making process. But I've had the experience, frankly, where I was able to come back, in year 2 and suggest a higher number than I would have if we had simply, tacked on 3% to the following year, because what I specifically knew about the pipeline and some of the larger gifts that were in the pipeline. And what was really helpful about that is that way in year 3, when the number, didn't go up the same way, I was able to point back to, again, the pipeline and be able to have specific conversations about, what I knew about, the solicitations that were planned for that year and how that could inform the process. And I think at the very least, being able to articulate how you came up with your number, what's driving it, why, even if you are going to have a gap thrust on you by another office, I think starting there, we're always going to have to try to manage to up to the expectations that are sort of thrust on us, but being very, very clear and articulate about how you derive the information and what that means in terms of your program. I mean, you're a professional and you're being paid to give advice on your program. So this is a way that you can do that.
Another question was, do you have a recommendation for tracking plan gifts?
Yeah, I mean, my suggestion is, and you'll see this in the sheet that we can download later off the website. I think in terms of plan gifts, and I think you can say this about a number of people that are sort of quasi frontline professionals, that the idea of the solicitations and proposals, the ones that we still have up on the screen, may be very relevant depending on the function of your plan giving officer. If they are more of a frontline officer and they're out in the field, then this is very, very valuable. And you'll see in the in the sheet that I've talked about, we also talk about assists and assisted, both visits and dollars. And I think that's another way to think about, if your plan giving operation is really more of a back office operation that is really supporting major gift officers in their face-to-face visits and providing them with valuable information and setting up gift agreements and things like that. You can still be tracking the proposals that they are influencing in this same way, but then maybe you're tracking them as assists as well, or instead of, or depending on the split, maybe they spend half their time out in the field and half of their time in the office. And so thinking about these as percent of FTE, I think, is also very useful.
Another question, could you please address the importance of leading indicators?
Sure. I think that, if your ultimate goal is to, let's say your ultimate goal is to increase participation in your annual fund, or let's say your ultimate goal is to increase the average gift of your annual fund response, or your annual fund donor. It's easy to do that on the back end, to be able to track the total numbers brought in by the total numbers of donors, and that gives you an average gift. But to be able to think on the front end about, and I think I should take a quick step back and say, annual giving and maybe gift processing are the two areas that perhaps are a bit more data heavy than some of the other functions. And so, you may have the opportunity to break out your metrics in a bit more sophisticated fashion for those programs, or to work up to that. So let's say that, your goal is to increase the average gift of your annual giving donor. Well, you can do that at the end of the year by dividing total dollars by total donors. But by the end of the year, it's too late to really do anything about that. So what are you doing proactively to track throughout the course of the year what will ultimately inform those lagging indicators? So are you doing specific high-end proposals or upgrade proposals, and are you tracking those? And those would be the leading indicators that I think would ultimately influence the lagging indicator of either total dollars or average gift. I think in the same way, when you're looking at major gift officers and we're talking about, really at the end of the day, you're probably interested in the total dollars raised. But in order for that not to be a number that's, in a vacuum at the end of the year, we really want to think about what will the goal of total numbers asked be. And so in this case, those solicitations, or I put proposals because, perhaps it's a corporate foundation officer, but how many, when we think at the beginning of the year, what's our goal for the number and the dollar value of the solicitations that we plan to ask and the number that we are asking? And those are the ways that you then can track throughout the year how close you're going to hit your target by the end of the year, which is, what that looks.
And we'll keep answering some questions, so for those of you who didn't stay on, that's great. We have a couple more questions, one of which is our 150 visits to industry standards. How does the standard vary when he or she has other responsibilities?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that everybody is trying to figure out what the industry standard is, and I think it probably varies a little bit from industry to industry, so I didn't, or sector to sector. I didn't put this in to suggest that this needs to be the number of visits for your program officer. I think, but I do think that, you know, in my experience, maybe 10 to 15 for a major gift officer, or 15. I've seen up to 20, but I think it's very, very rarely been hit. I think the most recent research that I've seen on this is that people tend to have ranges in the 10 to 15%, and they tend to average just slightly under 10 visits. Visits per month. So extrapolate that to over a full fiscal year. So, you know, again, I think that reinforces the importance of tracking that information and to have a beta test. I mean, you may find that 10 visits a month for whatever reason is manageable, or 15 is manageable, or it's not. So I think, you know, trying to wrap your head around what's going to be appropriate for your organization is really, really critical. But I think the second part of that question is even more critical. And I think that you need to establish metrics based on a full FTE, whether that's your the size of your portfolio, or your visits, or your dollars raised. You know, if it was a full, in this case it's a frontline officer, if it was a full FTE, full-time equivalent of one fundraising officer, what would the size of their portfolio be? What would the number of visits that they are expected to make on a monthly and annual basis be? And what would their annual goal be? And then you need to have the more qualitative or subjective conversations with your staff and with your leadership about, you know, what percent FTE they are focused in those various functions. And again, then that gets back to the conversation we had earlier with the person who asked the question from the smaller shop. You know, if you're wearing multiple hats in your role at an organization, and it's, you know, you're only 50% major gift fundraising, and you're 25% annual giving, and you're 20% stewardship, you're going to have to take portions of all of these. So I think but I do think that it's easiest to think about them as full-time equivalents, and then have conversations about what that means in terms of the goals, because that way you already have a benchmark in place. You know, if somebody else comes in a similar role, or if your role changes and it moves up or down, that we don't need to recreate the numbers every time. You just need to have a new conversation about what percent of that function you're focusing on now.
What would you suggest if certain metrics become impossible to achieve during a fiscal year? Change the metric or show defeat?
Show defeat. Well, I wouldn't say it is show defeat. I mean, I think that if you've beta tested and you think that your metrics are reasonable, I would caution you against, once you've kind of gone into your, you know, we're coming out of the testing mode and we're into the real, you know, we're into our world of performance metrics, I would caution you against, I guess, downgrading your metric system. I think, and there are some risks to that. I mean, if you're trying to obviously gain institutional buy-in, you're trying to have conversations with your leadership and your staff and make them feel positive about this exercise. I think unless there is, you know, if there's something catastrophic that happens to the organization where it really, really warrants a conversation about that, then I think you need to be very clear with both your staff and your leadership about why you're changing the metrics. But otherwise, I mean, if it looks like you're not going to hit them for whatever reason, I would caution you against that. I mean, you know, let's say you've got 2 major gift staff or 3 major gift staff, and you have goals for the program, and you lose, you know, an FTE. Well, clearly you may not be able to hit those goals, but it's a very explainable scenario why you didn't. And so rather than showing that the metrics are fluid, I would just simply start communicating, again, that idea of using these to manage up and out. I would start communicating that up front, before you get to the end of the fiscal year. Because what's going to happen is, let's say we go back to the old regime where the budget office gave you a target, and it was 3% above last year's target. And again, you're either tracking metrics or you're not tracking metrics, or you're not really tracking them, or you're thinking about changing them. It's not going to matter. At the end of the day, if the budget office gave you that 3% increase and you lose a major gift officer, you're still going to have the same kind of conversation. So I think in terms of trend analysis and projections, it's really, really critical to be thoughtful about keeping them in place and being very, very deliberate if and when you ever change them. And I think, the time to evaluate and change them is on a year-by-year basis.
Great. Let's do 2 more questions. Can you speak specifically about the cost to fundraise metric? How is it measured using total dollars raised, including pledges, or cash flow against all expenses, or only certain expenses?
I think that whether you're talking about cost per dollar raised or ROI, any of those indicators they sort of change depending on function to function and program to program. I think that there are organizations out there benchmarking whether you're looking at AAM or AAMC or CASE, NACE, that have kind of programmatic inputs on cost per dollar raised or ROI. But I think in particular when you're looking at function or team, if you're at a smaller organization, I think it's pretty easy to look at your fundraising and its associated costs. I think where it gets really, really complicated is when you're at a larger organization. For example, at the University of Chicago, there's a central office and it supports the school's units and divisions. And, so they get some amount of annual giving or major gift regional support. They get some support from the center, and how does that relate into their cost per dollar raised or ROI? So there are a number of different ways to think about that. But I think generally speaking, by function, being consistent is the best thing that you can. Communicating the metrics that you are using for both cost and associated fundraising, and then being consistent with them across the board is really, really important. And if anybody has more specific questions about that, I'm happy to, I think you can calculate them. I've seen them calculated both on fundraising progress and cash flow. I think at the end of the day, there's a shift being made from a focus on, or at least there has been over the course of the last few years, as the economy has, I think, influenced the way we think about projections. There used to be, I think, more of a focus on that fundraising progress, where you're really focused on the pledges coming in the door. And I think as the economy sort of tightened up, there's more of a focus on cash flow and what's actually coming in. And so I think you can do your ROI on either of them, depending on what's most important to your leadership. I experienced a shift again when I was at the University of Chicago, where we had been very, very focused on fundraising progress, and then over the course of the couple of years where things got tight, really, really shifted our focus to cash flow. So I don't know that there is a right or wrong when you're looking internally. When you're reporting out externally, to those annual benchmarks, annual surveys, they have very, very specific guidelines for how you report your ROI and cost per dollar.
Great. And last question, can you please repeat how we can get suggested metrics for a foundation office? I'm looking specifically for how to track costs to fundraise as well as annual and grant tracking.
I think are they asking for the sample that we're going to put up?
Actually, that probably will answer my question.
I think that will answer your question. But if you have additional questions after that, if that doesn't fully answer it, please just feel free to let me know, and I'm happy to talk offline about it.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we've actually answered all of the questions here that we've been asked. So thank you for, and I know that we're out of time, so I just want to thank everyone who has joined us today. And a special thank you to Carrie. You provided a wealth of information that's been really helpful. As you see on the screen, you can use code member 76 and receive complimentary access to our next webinar, which is Case Development 101. That's in March. And you can register on our website at campbellcompany.com. And until next time, thank you for attending today's webinar. And from all of us at Campbell & Company, we wish you a fantastic